Hello, I'm the Jim Stanham, and today it is story time. Now before we begin, there are two important things I need to say. The first is that we'll be going back a few pages here since I glossed over some of the complexities surrounding Rhodes' ascension. It won't take too long, don't worry. The second is that some of the lore has been reworked since the last Red World update, so the events in-game may not be accurate to the current lore. Rest assured though, these videos all have the most up-to-date lore as verified by the dev team. With that being said, have a seat by the fire as I tell you the story of a red world. The year is 1965, and the American succession is still unsettled. In the aftermath of the 1964 election and Nixon's assassination, the American political system was on the verge of anarchy. The quirks of the presidential election process were briefly mentioned in the previous video, but they are especially important to understand here, so let's explore it in more detail. Unlike most nations in the world, the United States uses an electoral college to elect presidential candidates. Each state gets a number of electoral votes dependent on the number of congressional seats they have, loosely based on population with a minimum of 3 electoral votes. And the candidate with the most votes in a state wins all of that state's electoral votes, though in the modern day there are exceptions. After the 23rd Amendment was ratified in 1961, Washington, D.C. also received 3 electoral votes. These states then send electors to the real election, where each elector casts a vote for the president and vice president. These electors are expected to vote for the candidate that wins the state, though they can choose to be faithless electors and vote for someone else. These votes are tallied by the incoming Congress, and the respective candidates who receive a majority of the electoral votes are declared president and vice president. However, if no presidential or vice presidential candidate wins a majority of electoral votes, then the election will be decided by Congress in what is called a contingent election, with the House deciding the president from the top 3 candidates, and the Senate deciding the vice president from the top 2. Contingent elections end when a candidate receives a majority of votes, with Congress voting in rounds until a candidate is chosen. It's a complicated process, but as long as every ticket is valid, the system works. Nixon's assassination threw this entire process into chaos, as now there were several states who had voted for a dead candidate, and these state legislators now had to decide on who their electors should vote for. Ultimately, the National Republican Party urged the state legislators to tell their electors to vote for the late Nixon's running mate, Jim Rhodes, for president. However, the GOP could not rally around a new vice presidential candidate in time for the electors' election, so many of these states voted for their own favorite sons instead, splitting the vote. On January 4th, 1965, the 89th Congress was sworn in, and on January 6th the electoral votes were counted. The results were clear. A contingent election was required for both president and vice president. The 3 presidential candidates would be Lyndon B. Johnson of the Democratic Party, Nelson Rockefeller of the Independents, and Jim Rhodes of the Republican Party, while the 2 vice presidential candidates would be Hubert Humphrey from Johnson's ticket and Goodwin Knight from Rockefeller's ticket. The stage was now set for the contingent election, and every congressman was ready to settle the presidential succession. With the Democrats out of power in the House, and the Republicans split on whether to support Rhodes or Rockefeller, the public feared the potential for a deadlocked Congress. Behind closed doors, though, all 3 candidates had been drumming up support. Ultimately, Rockefeller realized that he was never going to win a majority of votes, due to him abandoning the Republicans and running his own ticket. But he understood this position made him the kingmaker. He proposed an agreement with Rhodes known as the Treaty of Pennsylvania Avenue. In exchange for supporting civil rights legislation and increasing defense spending, Rockefeller would give his support and allow Rhodes to break the deadlock. Rhodes agreed, and on January 6th, Rhodes was elected president, despite coming dead last in the popular and electoral vote back in November. This infuriated Democrats across the country, and Johnson himself denounced the deal as a corrupt bargain, but there was nothing more to be done. Mercifully, the Senate election was much less tense. As there were only 2 candidates, and the Democrats held a comfortable majority in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey was swiftly elected vice president, marking the first time since 1796 when the president and vice president were elected from different tickets. On January 20th, Jim Rhodes and Hubert Humphrey were sworn in as the president and vice president of the United States. The succession, at last, was settled, and Rhodes had the unenviable task of reuniting the fractured nation and reasserting American supremacy on the world stage. After the inauguration, Rhodes immediately got to work to fulfill his end of the deal with Rockefeller. Increasing the national defense budget was an easy sell, but passing meaningful civil rights legislation would be a battle. The Republican Party, who controlled the House, was turning increasingly to the right and was not interested in passing sweeping civil rights reforms, while a large contingent of the Democratic Party, who controlled the Senate, were conservative Dixiecrats who were fervently pro-segregation. Both parties had liberal wings that were in support of civil rights, but they were not a majority, and the liberals in the Democratic Party were still furious at the corrupt bargain that put Rhodes in office, and were unwilling to work with him on all but the most pressing of issues. Still, Rhodes was undeterred, and after a year of bargaining and compromise, 2 bills were drafted that both parties could agree to. The first bill was the Civil Rights Act of 1966, and it banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment practices. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements, and it prohibited racial segregation in schools, at the workplace, and in public accommodations. This was a lofty bill, and it pleased many of the moderates in the civil rights movement, but the radicals remained unimpressed. The second bill was the Voting Rights Act of 1966. This bill, as the name implies, focused on protecting the right to vote, especially among African Americans. It outlawed discriminatory voting laws such as literacy tests, and prohibited states from drawing electoral districts that diluted the votes of protected minorities. These bills all had proper enforcement mechanisms built in, so states could be forced to comply with the law if they were being uncooperative. It wasn't a perfect pair of bills, but it was a good start, and Rhodes promised to continue the fight for civil rights through the rest of his term. However, the debate over civil rights and the perceived illegitimacy of the Rhodes administration caused many to turn against the Republican Party, and the 1966 midterms saw surprising losses for Republicans, with Democrats taking control of the House and expanding their majority in the Senate. This killed any hope Rhodes had of enacting meaningful legislation, and the new Speaker of the House, John McCormack, had supposedly said in private that he would ensure Rhodes remained a caretaker president. Desperate to salvage the situation, Rhodes turned to foreign policy in the hopes of repairing his reputation, and just like his late predecessor, he turned to Vietnam. Though Congress was stonewalling any attempts at passing legislation, Rhodes still had the power to intervene in Vietnam thanks to the Donlan Resolution passed the previous year. The Democrats were still eager to undermine Rhodes, but Speaker McCormack was a staunch supporter of the intervention in Vietnam, so Rhodes was free to continue the war as he saw fit. Rhodes massively increased the military presence in South Vietnam and spent billions of dollars in aid packages to the embattled country, straining America's budget. However, despite this overwhelming military presence, the U.S. Army was never ordered to invade North Vietnam. Billions of dollars worth of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam, but Rhodes knew that a direct invasion would prompt a retaliation from China and the Soviet Union, and Rhodes was terrified of Vietnam turning into another Korea. Unable to advance into North Vietnam, and unable to wind down support without being seen as soft on communism, Rhodes was trapped. Knowing that losing Vietnam would guarantee he would lose re-election, Rhodes had no choice but to double down, and hope that a pro-war stance would carry him to victory in 1968. To explain the events of 1968, one must first understand the societal context that led up to it. The Vietnam War, though popular among older generations, was increasingly unpopular with the younger baby boomer generation, who were being sent off to fight and die there. With both the Republican and Democratic establishments supporting the war effort, many turned to the radical left, who were seen as the only option for opposing the Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, student activist organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society skyrocketed in membership, forming a new left political movement. Rejecting the authoritarian old left vanguards like the Communist Party, this new left was focused on social justice, seeking the expansion of civil rights for African Americans and the LGBT community, as well as the expansion of free speech and democratic values. This swirling of left-wing debate raised a new generation of high-profile socialist thinkers, such as Michael Harrington, Noam Chomsky, and Bernie Sanders, all of whom will be relevant in a future video. These and other socialist thinkers influenced student protests across the nation, but the political establishment would not tolerate this dissent. With the support of President Rhodes and the governors of most states, the police and the National Guard were called in to suppress the protests, resulting in mass arrests. The harsh crackdowns did little to dissuade the students, though, and protests continued to swell throughout the nation. However, the political establishment still refused to heed the demands of the student protesters, which only served to radicalize these activists even further. In 1966, black student activists Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton formed the Black Panther Party, a Marxist-Leninist black power organization dedicated to the militant defense of black communities. Student groups like the Students for a Democratic Society began to splinter and militarize, with the most radical splinters, such as the Weather Underground, turning to terrorism to support their revolutionary goals. Naturally, this made many enemies of the movement, with conservatives horrified at the brazen disregard for traditions that, in their eyes, were the foundation of American society. The Republican Party's voter base, already trending right since the Nixon administration, took an increasingly hardline stance against these radicals, and were beginning to turn against President Rhodes for his failure to silence the anti-war protesters and crush the Black Power movement. Conservatives in the Democratic Party were also gaining power, as members of the liberal wing began to radicalize and leave for left-wing third parties, disappointed by Speaker McCormick's support of the war. However, not all conservatives believed that intervention in the Vietnam War was worthwhile. Some, especially in the Deep South, began to take an isolationist position, believing that the United States should stay out of foreign affairs and focus on internal matters first and foremost. With the fringes of politics being the only anti-war voices of note, America radicalized further, with the pro-war establishment under assault from both the left and right. With all these wildly differing political viewpoints in conflict with each other, it is time to discuss 1968. The primary elections of 1968 were some of the most bitterly contested in American history. The Republican Party was divided between the moderates backing Rhodes and the hardliners backing an insurgent campaign led by California Governor Ronald Reagan. Challenging an incumbent president in the primaries was not something to be done lightly, but Rhodes's domestic and foreign policy failures convinced Reagan and the hardliners that the Republican Party needed bold new leadership if it was to win the general election. The debates between Rhodes and Reagan were vicious, with Reagan denouncing Rhodes for his cowardice in not invading North Vietnam and his failure to combat the student protests, while Rhodes called Reagan a madman who would plunge the world into World War III. Ultimately, Rhodes won the Republican nomination, infuriating the hardliners in the party. Reagan refused to concede to Rhodes and immediately announced that he would run his own independent ticket, proclaiming that "we raise a banner of no pale pastels, but bold colors which could make it unmistakably clear where we stand on all the issues troubling the people." Meanwhile, the Democratic Party was once again on the verge of tearing itself apart, this time over the Vietnam War. Lyndon B. Johnson, seeking the nomination for a third time in a row, was fervently pro-war, while Vice President Hubert Humphrey and Congressman Robert F. Kennedy, brother of the late John F. Kennedy, stood against the war. Ultimately, the anti-war coalition failed to gain enough popular support, and Johnson won the nomination. Notably, all of the main contenders for the Democratic nomination were from the liberal wing, something that angered many conservative Democrats, especially former Alabama Governor George Wallace. Having already seen the leftward turn of the Democratic Party on civil rights, he formed the American Independent Party and prepared his own presidential run on a platform of ending desegregation and ending the Vietnam War. Throughout the whole primary season, protests and counter-protests were descending into riots, and many politicians and civil rights leaders were facing death threats. Though many politicians and public figures were aware of the threats to their life, there were two notable examples of the increasing political violence. Martin Luther King Jr., still the face of the civil rights movement despite increasing radicalization, was almost assassinated at a hotel room in Memphis, Tennessee, when he narrowly avoided a bullet shot from across the street. This caused a flurry of conspiracy theories to abound, with many civil rights activists believing that the government may have played a role in the attempted assassination, but most within the movement were simply grateful that their leader was still alive. Robert Kennedy was not so lucky. After winning the California Democratic primary, Kennedy was attending a campaign party at the Hotel del Coronado in Los Angeles, California, when suddenly he was shot 3 times by a man named Sirhan Sirhan. A Palestinian nationalist, Sirhan was outraged at Kennedy's pro-Israeli views and vowed to kill him in retaliation for a vote to supply Israel with fighter jets. Kennedy was rushed to a nearby hospital, where he died 26 hours later. Chaos began to consume the United States. Despite the best efforts of the police and the National Guard, nearly every city in America was overwhelmed with riots, all through to Election Day. North Carolina in particular was torn asunder from clashes between black communities and segregationists, to the point where the state government was forced to declare martial law and was unable to conduct an election at all. It seemed to many that the United States was on the brink of a full-blown revolution. However, the revolution was not to be. Though North Carolina's government was in a state of martial law, the rest of the country pulled through and was able to conduct the election. Violence across the country persisted, but polling stations remained open, and the people were still able to exercise their right to vote. However, just like the two elections before it, no candidate won a majority of the electoral vote. Johnson's ticket once again won a plurality of the electoral vote, with 201, along with a plurality of the popular vote. Rhodes came second with 164 electoral votes. Wallace came third with 104 electoral votes. Reagan's ticket came last with 56 electoral votes. And since North Carolina was unable to hold a vote, their electors remained undeclared. Finally, perhaps due to the election being over, or perhaps just due to the passage of time, the fire that was consuming America had begun to burn itself out. By January of 1969, the rioting was finally brought under control. The protests were dispersed, and the people returned to their homes. However, the question of succession was still unsettled, and just like 4 years prior, Congress was deadlocked. With the 1968 elections concluded, the 90th Congress was sworn in, and the House had to decide on who to elect as president: Lyndon B. Johnson, Jim Rhodes, or George Wallace. Though Democrats still controlled the House and the Senate, the divisions between the liberal and conservative wings meant that the House was split between Johnson supporters and Wallace supporters. In addition, this election saw a record number of independent candidates elected to Congress, each of whom became wildcards in their own right. In the end, the conservative and liberal Democrats came to an agreement known as the Southern Compromise. In exchange for being awarded the presidency, Johnson was forced to renege on several of his campaign promises and concessions to the conservative Democrats. To begin, Johnson would end federal efforts of desegregation by stopping federal busing programs and restricting the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act of 1966. Wallace further demanded that Johnson enact policies from Wallace's own platform, expanding federal Social Security programs and ending American involvement in the Vietnam War if a victory could not be achieved quickly. Finally, Johnson promised to only serve one term in office, paving the way for Wallace's own presidential run in 1972. This deal infuriated many liberal Democrats, but the liberals could not deliver a realistic counteroffer, and most Democrats just wanted the succession to finally be settled. Reluctantly, Johnson agreed to the compromise, and on January 20th, Johnson was sworn in as President of the United States, hoping to finally reassert American supremacy on the world stage. Though his administration was already kneecapped by the Southern Compromise, Johnson still had the rest of his term to mount a comeback, and he sought to fix the many woes that plagued America, both domestically and abroad, starting with the economy. The exponential costs of the Vietnam War, coupled with the chaos of 1968, brought the country into a deep recession, and Johnson sought to counter these economic troubles with his ambitious Great Society program, harkening back to the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration. The main focus of the Great Society was the war on poverty, funding numerous government welfare initiatives such as Medicaid and the food stamp program that aimed to provide support for the most impoverished Americans. However, infighting between the factions of the Democratic Party meant that it was impossible to raise enough new taxes to fund the Great Society and the Vietnam War. Still believing that the war would be won soon, Johnson made a classic economic blunder. He chose to finance both the Great Society and the Vietnam War by printing more money. At first, these government programs were a success, and the poverty rate in the United States began to decrease. But soon these successes were wiped out by skyrocketing inflation. Now, this was not the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, but it was enough to shake the international community's confidence in the US dollar. This would not be the end of Johnson's troubles either, as his eccentric personality would cause yet another bout of humiliation for America on the world stage. In early 1969, Johnson had met with the Joint Chiefs of Staff regarding the situation in Vietnam, where Johnson had allegedly exposed himself to the generals and threatened to piss all over him if a breakthrough didn't happen in Vietnam soon. Reports of this incident had leaked to the press, and the story spread like wildfire across the world. Newspapers from New York to London to Moscow were printing this story, incredulous that the President of the United States could behave so obscenely. This report was even seen by the Soviet Politburo, where First Secretary Georgy Malenkov joked that he didn't know if Johnson lived in the White House or a mental asylum. Granted, the White House denied all allegations, and even tried to push back against this supposed slander, but the damage had already been done to Johnson's reputation and the reputation of America writ large. To the international community, including America's allies in NATO, Johnson was not a strong leader who would lead America to victory, but a buffoon and a laughingstock. Johnson would spend the rest of his term attempting to repair his reputation, but even his own party had begun to turn against him. Democratic infighting between the conservative and liberal wings once again threatened to destroy the party, but this time the balance was shifting. Perhaps due to Johnson's unpopularity, or perhaps just a sign of the times, the conservative wing began to dominate the Democratic Party. Liberal Democrats were being crushed in primaries, and any allies Johnson had in Congress were quickly turning their backs on him to save their own skins. However, the weakening of the liberal wing would have dire consequences for the Democratic Party, as the 1970 midterms would turn into a bloodbath. After the 1968 election, Democrats held a comfortable majority in the House and a slim majority in the Senate. However, the infighting within the Democratic Party spelled disaster for the 1970 midterms, with Republicans winning a majority in the House and the Senate, granting them full control of Congress for the first time since 1955. The weakening of the liberal wing for this cycle caused many liberal Democrats to bolt for more radical options, which saw independents and third parties nearly triple in seats in the House of Representatives. However, the true winner of the midterms was the conservative coalition, which had dominated Congress before 1966. The conservative Democrats and Republicans, now once again dominating both houses of Congress, worked together to oppose the remaining liberals from both parties, as well as the left-wing third parties. This further isolated President Johnson, who was now unable to pass any more legislation related to his Great Society, and many now considered him to be a lame duck. With no other avenues available to maintain his policies, Johnson was forced to capitulate, both figuratively and literally. Though Johnson was among the most fervently pro-war Democrats, the economy was still in recession due to the reckless money printing and debt that had been accumulated to fund the war effort in Vietnam. On the advice of Hubert Humphrey, who had become Johnson's special advisor on Vietnam, Johnson had already stopped the bombing campaigns back in 1969, and prospects for the South Vietnamese looked increasingly grim. For 2 years, Humphrey had been working on Johnson's behalf to negotiate a settlement to the conflict. Centered in Paris, negotiations at first went nowhere. The South Vietnamese insisted that the Viet Cong be removed from the peace negotiations, while the North Vietnamese demanded that the South Vietnamese government be replaced entirely with one more suitable to their interests. A breakthrough was finally achieved in 1971, with the settlement known as the Paris Peace Accords. In this peace deal, the United States would fully withdraw from South Vietnam in exchange for North Vietnam doing the same. The South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, and neutral forces would enter into a unity government to ensure free and fair elections in preparation for the peaceful reunification of Vietnam. Johnson tried to sell this as a victory that ensured South Vietnamese independence, but the continued survival of North Vietnam was undoubtedly a victory for the Communists. With US forces withdrawn, the South Vietnamese had lost their greatest defender, and the international community was uncertain that peace would last in Vietnam. Still, the war was now over, and that meant fewer government expenditures. There was now a chance for the economy to recover, and for that Johnson made an unprecedented economic decision. Since the end of World War II, most of America's allies had their currencies tied to the US dollar through the Bretton Woods system, through which their currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to the value of gold. However, America's rampant inflation coupled with growing public debt caused many of these countries to rethink their commitment to the Bretton Woods system. By the end of 1970, West Germany and Switzerland had abandoned the system entirely, and France was in the process of cashing in their dollar reserves for the equivalent value in gold. Working to solve this crisis, Johnson met with a dozen advisors at his ranch in Texas, most notably Treasury Secretary John Connally. Their advice was radical, but Johnson needed radical solutions to handle this economic disaster. On August 13, 1971, Johnson announced that the dollar would no longer be tied to the value of gold, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. In the short term, these policies were a political success, but ultimately this would become an even greater economic failure, bringing in the instability of fiat currencies at a time when America was ill-prepared to handle it, and further distancing the United States from its allies in Europe. The economy spent 4 years in recession, Vietnam was lost, and American credibility on the world stage took yet another dive. Johnson's term had been a string of unmitigated failures, with the dreams of a great society crushed under the weight of the ascendant conservative coalition. All that was left to do was watch the election unfold, but before the primary season could ramp up, tragedy yet again struck the nation. Hubert Humphrey did not sit idle while the conservative coalition hobbled Johnson's administration. From his position in the Johnson administration, Humphrey continued to advocate for progressive ideals within the Democratic Party. He had already become infamous among conservatives for denouncing the Southern Compromise, and many Americans hoped or feared that he would run for president again, challenging George Wallace in the 1972 Democratic primary on a platform of continuing the Great Society that Johnson had envisioned. Continuing to rally the liberal wing and their allies, he attended a convention hosted by the AFL-CIO, the country's largest trade union organization, on November 22, 1971. At 7:54 p.m., while exiting the building, a bomb concealed in an unattended briefcase detonated, killing Humphrey instantly and severely wounding several union members. The hunt for the perpetrators began immediately, though there were no solid leads, as a myriad of different individuals and organizations were suspected. 8 hours after the assassination, though, the Weather Underground passed a communique to the press, implicating a splinter group led by Brian Flanagan, who was arrested 2 days later. With Humphrey's assassination, the torch of American progressivism was snuffed out, at least for a while. Had Humphrey not been assassinated, it's possible the liberal Democrats could have credibly challenged Wallace in 1972, and perhaps even won the presidency. Maybe Humphrey could have even heralded a reversal of fortunes in the Cold War. However, those dreams of a progressive America were killed with Humphrey, as the conservative coalition solidified their grip. The 1972 primaries for both parties were dominated by the conservative coalition. Johnson did not run for re-election, as per his agreement with the Southern Democrats, and his unpopularity meant he would have been unlikely to win anyway. The liberal Democrats were horrified at the prospect of George Wallace winning the primary, but after Hubert Humphrey's assassination, there were no more high-profile candidates to credibly challenge him. Vice President Edmund Muskie launched a desperate campaign to prevent Wallace's nomination, but his role in the failed Johnson administration tarnished his reputation, and Wallace won the nomination handily. Surprisingly, Wallace made a sharp pivot to the center, dropping segregation from his platform entirely and declaring himself a moderate on racial matters, though whether this was political theater or an honest change of heart is uncertain. The Republican primary was split between the conservative wing led by hardliner John Ashbrook and the remnants of the liberal wing led by Pete McCloskey. Surprisingly, the primary seemed to be dead even at the start, until Ashbrook pulled off an upset victory in McCloskey's home state of California, effectively ending McCloskey's campaign. In his acceptance speech, Ashbrook reiterated his campaign slogan, "No left turns," promising to rebuke the radical left and bring prosperity to the American people. Without Wallace, the American Independent Party collapsed into irrelevancy, and though liberals in both parties were outraged at the primary outcomes, there were no more high-profile liberal figures to rally around, and so there would be no more insurgent independent campaigns. As such, for the first time since 1956, the race would be primarily between the Democratic and Republican candidates. This did not stop some minor parties from campaigning, though, most notably the Communist Party USA, with Chairman Gus Hall running for president, and the newly formed Libertarian Party, with John Hospers running for president. Still, the situation for these third parties was hopeless, and none of them cracked 2% of the popular vote. Though the United States was just barely out of recession by mid-1972, the economy was the most important issue of the general election, with Wallace and Ashbrook being almost polar opposites on how to improve it. Wallace championed Johnson's anti-poverty programs, believing that solving poverty should be the #1 priority of the government. Ashbrook, on the other hand, denounced the war on poverty as a massive hole in the federal budget, and believed that the government's role in the economy should be massively reduced. The economic crises of the previous administrations caused the public to turn away from federal anti-poverty programs, instead supporting Ashbrook's supply-side economics, believing that the wealth created would trickle down to everyday Americans. Though liberals and leftists were dismayed at the outcomes of the primaries, the rioting of 1968 was nowhere to be seen, and Americans were able to fulfill their civic duty in peace. That November saw a Republican landslide, with Ashbrook becoming the first candidate since 1956 to win an outright majority by carrying nearly every northern state and even challenging Wallace's hold over the Solid South. For the first time in over a decade, stability had returned to American politics, and President Ashbrook was ready to finally reassert American supremacy on the world stage. Thank you so much for watching. I know, I'm late again with the lore video, but this script had to go through a bunch of revisions to make sure all the lore was up to date. For the time being though, I think I'm going to have to take a bit of a break for this series while we get all the lore sorted out for the 70s and early 80s. I want to make sure that I tell the whole story, and unfortunately we have a lot more pages left to write. For now though, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and hit the sub button. It really does help me out a lot, and I will see you next time.